I think that the Kaddish can be broken down into a structure like this: an A, B, C, A, B. That could be the structure. I'm only talking about mourner's Kaddish. There are 5 Kaddishim, 5 types of Kaddishim: Chatzi Kaddish, Kaddish Shalem, etc. I'm talking about mourner's Kaddish. So here's one way to go about organizing it. So it's Yikadav Yikadash Shemei Rabbah. That is part A, and that's basically saying what we want. That's basically saying what we want to happen. We want to happen that God's name will be, number 1, exalted, Yitgadal, and number 2, Yitgadash, sanctified. Those are 2 things. They're different. That God's name is, and I'm just going to say in brief, God's name is exalted means that everyone will know that God's great. But that God's name is sanctified, the Malbim say that everyone knows that God is not of this world. When something's sanctified, you make it holy to yourself. You make it separate. It's something holy. And so God does all the miracles. That's something humans can't do. So that's the idea. We want people to recognize, number 1, that God's great and does great things. And number 2, that God's beyond this world. Those are Yitgadal, Yitgadash. And Shmei Rabbah, we want God's name to be spread. And the idea of that is that everyone will recognize God. So that's kind of like that's part A. And part B is, how is that going to happen? How is that going to happen? Through God establishing God's kingdom in the world. And what's God's kingdom? It means that the world will be corrected. The world will be in its perfected state. That's a later stage of our history, where there will be world peace, and the animals will get along, and there won't be any hunger, and everyone will have a lot of knowledge. It'll be a very blissful and good time. And that's really what we want, the world to be fixed and corrected and be at that stage. And so that's kind of what we ask for here in the second piece. Here we go. And the world that God created, that God's kingship should be established. God's kingship should be Yamlich Malchuteh, should be established. And then we just say we want it to happen in our days and in your days, in the days of all of Yisrael. And very quickly, Ba'agalav Izman Kariv Imru Amen. Don't say Amen. So that's really what we want. So basically, if you just go, there's a part A and part B here. Yikadav Yikadash Shemei Rabbah, that God's name should be exalted and sanctified. How is that going to happen? That's going to happen through God's kingship being established in the world. The world that God in the world that God created according to God's will. And His kingship will be established. That's basically the structure, A, B. And then, this is a pretty exciting thing, right? To think about everything's going to be great, the world will be corrected. So that's why we kind of have this natural outpouring of, Yehei Shmei Rabbah Mivorach. This is kind of everyone announces together. May God's name be exalted. May God's name be blessed forever and all time. So I should be reading the English. This would be even more helpful here on 240. Okay, so that's A, B, and then we have this announcement. We all say it together. Then we start again with A, B again. Okay, so the first part discusses the exalted aspect of God's name. Part A, we talked about God's name to be exalted. How will it be exalted? In all these ways. Blessed, praised, glorified, exalted, raised, honored, uplifted, and lauded be the name of the Holy One. That's God's name being exalted. Then the second part, we said God's name being sanctified. That's what we talk about this next part. Beyond any blessing, song, praise, and consolation out in the world, and say amen. Meaning God's name should not just be exalted, etc., but even beyond any praise. That's the idea of God's name being sanctified. Beyond our ability to even express it. Everyone following me, or is this somewhat? Is it, yeah, it's going okay so far? All right, good. So far, so good. Okay, good. And so this last part, then we pick up where we talked about the part B in the beginning. Part B was that God's kingship will be established. What's going to happen when God's kingship is established? There'll be peace in the world. And that's why we ask for peace here. It says here, may there be great, Yehei Shlamar Rabbah, may there be great peace from heaven, and life for us and all Israel, and say amen. May he who makes peace in his places make peace for all of Israel, and say amen. So basically, yeah. That's what we want. The Messiah to come. We want the peace in the world. We want God's kingship to be established. Now, we want Mashiach now. Ever heard that statement before? Well, we do. That's why we say, in your lifetime, in your days, in the lifetime of all the house of Israel, swiftly and soon. So we want that to happen quickly. That's why we say that in the beginning. But the idea is that we want God's name to be magnified through God's kingship being established, and ideally in the Messianic days, and everything that comes after that with all the blessings that come from that. And that's basically the structure here. And so the question that one could ask is why are we saying this now for the mourner? I mean, this is like a nice prayer about we want God's name to be sanctified in the world. Why are we doing this? So there are three reasons why we say this now for the mourner. The first one is like what you said, and you said it's for the individual, not for the deceased. It's for the mourner. Because when the mourner sanctifies God's name and say, I believe that God's kingship is going to reign, I want it to reign, I want God to be everywhere, that's not always easy to do in time of mourning. That's a time of suffering and pain, and you are kind of acknowledging God, and you are attesting to your faith in God. So that's kind of for the mourner, kind of a tziduk hadin, they call it. I don't know how to translate that, but affirmation of God's judgment. So that's that. But another one is to say that you are sanctifying God's name with the community, with at least 10 men and as many people, everybody who's here. You're doing that, and through sanctifying God's name, there's nothing better you could do. That's literally, there's nothing better you can do than sanctifying God's name, according to the text that I've read over the years. Because sanctifying God's name is really what the purpose of creation, that we're here to sanctify God's name, spread God's message, spread good in the world. And so when you're sanctifying God's name, you are doing a good deed. And through doing that good deed, the best deed, you're strengthening the lot of your loved one who has passed. Because there's a concept that a child can influence the lot of their parent. So that's why you do it with this specific thing, because this is sanctification of God's name. That's a big thing. And the last one is that maybe not everybody's perfect, and so we want to sanctify God's name in order to counterbalance. Maybe there was a desecration of God's name, maybe by our parents in some way. So we want to kind of counterbalance that with the sanctification of God's name.